I'd like to officially welcome everybody who's coming and those who will be coming today to join us for GemQuest number 9 on rubies. Now, just a little bit of background for those of you who may be new to our program. GemQuest is a cooperative program between Jolion Ralph, who is a mastermind of databases, being the person who's put together both Mindat.org and Gemdat.org, which are nonprofit organizations. And this program is a nonprofit, nonpartisan program, whose main purpose is to educate and to fill in some of the gaps that we have in our knowledge that we get from our overall education over the years in GEMS, and give us interesting and I hope insights into each special gem that we present. And this meeting will be focused, as you all know, on rubies. Now, to let you know ahead of time, we were going to have two speakers at this program today, but unfortunately, Vincent Pardieu had a very urgent family matter he could not ignore and had to leave and be in a place where he was unavailable to the internet for the time of our programming. But he has agreed that in the near future, if we can arrange it, we will videotape his portion that he would have contributed to the program, and it will be, I hope, archived together with what we're going to see tonight and today. So the program's topic is ruby, and the word ruby originates from the Latin rubinus, which means red stone. It's a stone whose main coloring agent, which seems rather odd to some, is chromium, because it's the same coloring agent that gives emeralds their amazing green color. The redness of rubies is said to symbolize love and passion. And some people say that we've been mining rubies for 8,000 years, although other sources say it was first discovered at 2,000 years ago in India. Rubies have a very important stone in the world of gems. And if you look into the old and ancient writings of India, you'll find that ruby was ascribed the highest rating of a stone. It was the lord of the stones in the Hindu writings, and was called Ratnanayaka. I don't know if I'll get my hand around this. Ratnanayaka. I hope I pronounced that right without massacring it. And it was basically divided into castes, something like the caste system that was present in India for many, many centuries. And so the very finest of rubies were in the highest caste, and so on down the road. Believe it or not, Chinese Feng Shui practitioners say ruby has a masculine nature, but we don't want to be sexist in any way. But they did think that if you had, the Burmese legends had it that if you had a ruby in your body, you would be invincible. And this is not surprising, because an awful lot of very rare and valuable gems were purported to make our bodies of the owners invincible. And of course, that made them very valuable things to have and be worn very publicly by people who had enough money to own a very fine ruby. Now, a lot of times in the history of gems, you'll find that the value and the properties associated with that gem have something to do with their color. In the case of ruby, it's not a, please, would someone please mute? And find that the ruby's color of red was related to things that could heal in the area of blood. And so this is not unusual in the history of gems and the superstitions that surround gems. The main mining areas of rubies are all across the world: Afghanistan, Burma, or Greenland, Malawi, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, USA, India, Mozambique, Russia, Zimbabwe, Brazil, and the French Alps. It's in a lot of the continents, and oftentimes found in both in situ as well as in detritus from former erosional factors and old riverbeds. So it's found in a wide variety of geological locations. Now, our speaker, our one and only speaker today, is known to many people because he perhaps is the best respected and well-known expert in the area of gems relating to rubies and sapphires of anybody in the world. And Richard Hughes, who works with Lotus Gemology, and they have offices all around the world, is one of the world's foremost experts on ruby, the author of several books and over 170 articles. And he's received numerous industry awards. He's the co-winner of the 2004 Edward J. Gublin Most Valuable Article Award from Gems and Gemology magazine, a Richard Litico Journalism Award from the American Gem Society, and in 2010 he received the Antonio C. Bonanno Award for Excellence in Gemology from the Accredited Gemological Association. And the Association Française de Gemologie in 2013 said that Richard was considered to be one of the 50 most important figures that shaped the history of gems since antiquity. And that's a pretty high praise, I would think. 2016, Richard, as some others have been recently, was awarded a visiting professorship at Shanghai's Hongji University. And in 2017, we saw the culmination of many, many decades of work and research in the publication of, with his wife and his daughter and himself, called Ruby and Sapphire, a Gemologist's Guide, which is basically a standard issue for many people who want to know what there is to know about this small and very special and valuable end of the gem world. And in 2020, he was elected to the board of directors of Accredited Gemology Association and was appointed to the editorial review board of Gems and Gemology and the Australian Gemologist magazine. So this is a man who has a widely accepted expertise, and he likes to sleep in. So because of that peculiarity, I'm sure which many of us share, he made it possible for us, excuse me, to hear and see him today by being pre-recorded. Otherwise, he would have had to get up at 2 a.m. to present, and somehow that didn't work. So I'd like you to welcome into your homes Richard Hughes, as he was recorded, and he answered 6 questions I gave him that I wanted hopefully to cover as broadly as possible the subject of rubies, and I hope you'll enjoy his presentation.
Ray wanted to know what are the main characteristics that separate a ruby from a sapphire. In the trade, we have an old saying that if you're selling it, it's a ruby. If you're buying it, it's a sapphire. Obviously, because of the differences in price. I'm going to share my screen here. If you can enable that for me.
Of course, hold on one moment. Okay, sorry, I've lost the option here. Don't worry, I will actually edit this mess out of the video.
No problem. That was a good thing. He told me you were going to be able to edit it.
Okay, so right, yeah. All right, okay, so now over to you again. You should be
okay. So I'm going to just share my screen so you can see an example of this. This is a photograph of the corundum family of gems. As most people are aware, corundum is aluminum oxide, and it crystallizes in the hexagonal or trigonal system, depending on which side of the fence you sit on. Everything that is not red in gemology is termed sapphire. And then stones that are red are termed ruby. This is actually an interesting case because ruby, what we call ruby today, was never really found in the ancient world. It wasn't found until the 6th or 7th century when they discovered some red stones in what is now either Tajikistan or Afghanistan on the border. And these stones were termed ruby. And sorry about that, because my phone is ringing. Hello? Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm in the middle of a webinar right now. So I'm sorry, I can't talk right now. All right, bye. Sorry about that.
That's all right. Okay, as I said,
So,
we can edit this.
so they had some stones that were found in Greek and Roman times that were called carbunculus. And, you know, there's probably a 99% chance that these stones were all garnet. So even though the term ruby is a very ancient word, none of these stones were today's ruby. Then in the 6th, 7th century, they discovered at a place called Kuilal in what is now Tajikistan, but the deposits actually go across the border into Afghanistan. They discovered a red stone and they started calling that ruby. The old term for it was balas ruby. And most of the famous rubies in ancient times were actually this stone, which today we call red spinel. And let me see if I can find a picture of a balas ruby for you. And so most of the stones were actually red spinel. And some of these were quite large in size, and the royal collections in Europe are full of examples of these stones. And for example, the so-called Black Princess ruby, the Timor ruby, and many others. These are actually red spinels. And they come from, here's an example of one in the imperial crown in Moscow's Kremlin. And there are many other examples of these. And so that became ruby. It was only much later, hundreds of years later, that what we call ruby today started to appear. And those stones came from Burma, now present day Myanmar. And so what we call ruby today actually didn't exist in history for all practical purposes. And some people, like my friend Vince Pardue, suggest that, you know, the real ruby was actually spinel. Now, both of these stones have a unique property. They both have the ability to fluoresce to visible light. And the color of the fluorescence is the same as the body color of the stone. And so these stones are really special because they have kind of a supercharged color. It's not just a body color created by absorption of light in the visible spectrum, but they also take the smaller wavelengths to the shorter wavelengths, and they turn those into emission in the deep red. And that's what gives both red spinel and ruby their superb color. And that's a big part of why ruby is such a special gem. But it's not limited to ruby, it's also found in red spinel. So what are we talking about? We're talking about, and I'm just looking for something. Here's some examples of the red fluorescence in ruby. And red spinel has the same effect. And B.W. Anderson, the famous British gemologist, he used to use a cross filters technique to display this, which is illustrated in this diagram here. But you don't really need to do that nowadays. With the advent of lasers, you can take a green laser or a blue laser or a violet laser, like a 405 or a 533 laser, and you shine it on a ruby and you get this incredible glow. You can even do this if you're visiting a museum. If you carry the laser with you, you can poke it at stones behind a glass showcase, and if they are ruby or spinel, they will glow bright red. And a lot of the red stones in museum collections are actually mislabeled. They're actually garnet, but you can tell the difference if you have a laser in your pocket, and you can use that laser. Now, of course, the question of what constitutes a ruby and how do you separate it from a sapphire? This is a question of nomenclature, and it's not an easy question to answer because people do not see color in exactly the same way. And describing colored gemstones is one of the most devilishly difficult things there are on the planet. And the reason is that faceted gemstones are not a single color. It's actually a three-dimensional mosaic of colors, and those colors will change across a single facet, across the stone, and they will also change if you move your head, or you move the stone, or you change the light source or move the light source. And so it's incredibly difficult to describe the appearance of faceted gemstones because of this. And this has led to a lot of confusion. There's some armchair people in the world. A lot of them appear to be on Facebook, interestingly enough. And they think it's a real simple thing to describe color in gemstones. And I've heard this story from so many of them. They say, why don't you just get a Pantone book or some kind of a color atlas? Well, there are good reasons why we can't do that. And I'm gonna just share my screen again. Here we go. And I will show you some of the reasons why we can't do that. First of all, we have something called gamut limits. Every device has a gamut. That's the range of colors that can be reproduced. Our eyes have a gamut, and that gamut in the scientific world is put into a CIE diagram. And this has been done, close to 100 years ago. And so this horseshoe shaped thing that you see here with these colors inside it is a CIE diagram of the color response of the human eye.
Sorry, Richard, we're not actually seeing that diagram on screen at the moment.
Okay, so I'm going to have to.
You have to do the start.
Share my screen again. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let me see if I can find it in another chapter here. Okay.
But of course, these diagrams are very important for anyone doing digital photography as well.
Absolutely, amen to that.
Yeah. So anyone serious in photography fully understands the problem of converting light into a digital form and the restrictions that you have based on your screen devices, and that's why photographers are very, very fussy about the type of screens that they will purchase. Anyway, I see the diagram now, so back over to you.
Absolutely, and that's such an important point. And so this, again, this horseshoe-shaped diagram shows all the colors that the average human eye can see. Then you'll notice that inside it, there is a green line, and that green line is the color range that can be produced by a high-quality printing press, the 4-color printing press. The black triangle outside that green line are the colors that can be reproduced by a high-quality color monitor. And what is a high-quality color monitor? Well, they start at about $2,000 and go up from there. Anything outside those two triangles literally cannot be reproduced. So you can't print those colors. And in the case of the black diagram, the Adobe color space, you can't reproduce those colors on a color monitor. But for gemstones, those colors outside those two polygons, they're the most important colors because they're the most highly saturated colors and they're the most expensive colors. And this is one reason only as to why you cannot have a printed book of colors and expect to accurately describe the color of gemstones. The other reason, of course, as I said before, is that faceted gemstones are not a single color. Here you can see a yellow sapphire. And if I were to ask you to count the colors in the stone, there would be hundreds of different colors. And every time you move the stone, those colors change. Or if you use a different light source, if you switch from, let's say, skylight, natural skylight in the morning to natural skylight in the middle of the day, or at the end of the day, or to a fluorescent tube or an incandescent bulb, all of these cause radical changes in the color of the stone. Therefore, it is probably several of orders of magnitude more complex to describe the appearance of a colored gemstone than it is to do a diamond. And even with diamonds, when you're only dealing with the lack of color, what do diamond graders do? Well, they flip the stone table down so they can look through the back of the stone, because when it's face up, the color is so faint they can't see it. And so for colored gemstones, they are incredibly complex. And then there's pleochroism and color zoning and asymmetrical cutting. And there are textured inclusions like silk. There are reflective inclusions like fissures and crystals and on and on. It is incredibly complicated. And that's what I used to think colored stone grading would be possible. I no longer believe that, because these objects are so complicated. Not to mention, and this is something I like to show people, here's an image of, 75 or 100 people. Who is the most beautiful? If you ask 100 people, I'm sure you'll get 100 different answers. You have to account for taste. And so when you're talking about gemstones, it's like mineral specimens, which is something you know a lot about. There is the aesthetic taste of judging them. Some people have very highly refined taste, and other people are like Donald Trump, and they paint their toilet gold and all of that. Who's to say who's right? It's a personal choice. Do you like vanilla ice cream or do you like chocolate? I like vanilla. How about you?
I prefer chocolate, but there you go.
Yeah, see there? You're wrong.
Yeah, I probably am.
No, it's a personal choice. There's no wrong or no right with this. And so when you ask people about colors, which color do you prefer? You're asking people to make a personal choice. Now, there is a marketplace, and the marketplace provides some data to you. And so I can say that certain colors fetch higher prices in the market, but that doesn't make it true that those are the best colors for you. And I think that kind of goes to the second question, which is, many decades ago, the definition of what is a good ruby is a pigeon's blood ruby. And this is an area of huge disagreement for many of the reasons that I've given already in our conversation. In Burma, which was the original home of the ruby, they developed over time a classification system based on certain natural things in their environment. And so one of the things that the colors of ruby were compared to were pigeon's blood. Pigeon's blood. Okay. Another category, the second level down in their hierarchy, was something called rabbit's blood. And then they had a half a dozen or more different categories. One of them is quite humorous.
sorry, Richard. I think we're
And
breaking
the
up a little bit on the.
Indians often bought stone. Married in India, you need a lot of jewelry. And of course, you don't have the money to buy a lot of really fine stones. So they tend to buy lower grade stones to create these incredible wedding costumes. And so those lower grade stones tended to be dark. And in the Burmese hierarchy of ruby quality, there's even one category that is called even an Indian would cry. Meaning it's so dark that even the Indians will reject this. They have another category that's the water that comes out of a pump. The first 3 times you pump a well, the water that comes out is usually muddy. And so that's categories. The Chinese have hundreds of categories for jade. But this was the system that developed, and that's where the term pigeon's blood came from. It was considered the top color of ruby. But who's ever seen a pigeon's blood? I mean, what does it look like? Very few people have seen it. And as many people have pointed out, is it the blood coming from the heart or to the heart? When you try to get precise with these things, that's when you get into a whole lot of trouble. And so sadly, certain people in the gemological community have decided, because dealers kept saying, can you put this on the report? I want you to put pigeon's blood on the report. Can you put this on the report? And when I first started in gemology, we always resisted this, because I would say to the dealers, well, how do you define pigeon's blood? And every dealer had a different definition. And so most gem labs refused to put these terms on their reports because they're so difficult to define. That changed probably 15 years ago, when one very prominent lab in Bangkok started using the term pigeon's blood and royal blue. And now there's an avalanche of this kind of terminology. One of the really difficult things to define is the term Padparaja. And this was another thing that people asked us to do. Can you put Padparaja on the report? And again, we resisted it for the longest time, but nowadays the market is demanding that these terms be on the report. And then those same dealers bitch and moan because the labs, one lab's definition doesn't match the other lab's definition. Regarding Padparaja sapphire, a number of years ago, I wrote an article about it, and I actually did a survey. And the word. And so I did a survey. I had on my iPad this illustration that you see here, which is the two-dimensional representation of tone saturation of Pau in Sri Lanka. Okay, and I asked them, well, what would your definition of the color range of Padparaja be? Here are 6 of the answers with the little circles that you see there. There is no agreement on these things. And so if dealers themselves can't agree, how can you expect laboratories to agree? Because dealers have far more experience looking at the quality of stones than gemologists do. Really, really difficult. And so from the buyer or collector point of view, I always tell people, buy what you like. If you're spending a lot of money, go get a lab report. Make sure you know what you're buying from a good lab. Nowadays, many stones, you have to have 2 or 3 lab reports in order to sell it. But go get a lab report, but don't ignore your eyes. it's you who's going to have to own this thing. And interestingly enough, in the old days, going back, 1,000+ years ago, it used to be in India and in Sri Lanka, when you went to buy a stone, the dealer would loan it to you. And you would get to take it home and see how you liked it. A lot of it had to do astrological effects and things like that. But it gave you the chance to look at the stone in different lighting conditions and get to know it a little bit. And so that's a good idea. If you're buying stones, look at them in different light sources. Make sure you get a lab report from a good lab that verifies that what the dealer says about the stone is true, and then buy what you like. Okay, I think that's enough on that subject, huh? Okay, so the third question was, in the real estate business, the old axiom is location, location, location. But what about the location for gemstones? Is the origin of a gemstone important? The answer, of course, is yes and no. It's a little bit like the color question. Certain origins tend to produce better quality stones than others. For example, when it comes to sapphire, Australia has basalt-derived sapphires that tend to be dark in color, and they never reach the kind of prices that you can get from stones that come from Burma or Sri Lanka or Kashmir, and in recent years, Madagascar. And so when you think about the origin of stones, we're only talking about the very best qualities, because the vast majority of stones that come from any origin are not worth cutting. The quality is too low. It's only a fraction of 1% of rough that's recovered from most places that is of gem quality. And so origin is important, yes, but then this kind of paper chase, getting a lab report that says a certain origin, has led to a certain collective hysteria that's completely distorted the market. For example, the major source of sapphire for 2 millennia was Sri Lanka. And that was a place where the biggest and best sapphires came from. Then once they started to mine a bit more in Burma, particularly in the 19th century, Burma started producing blue sapphires. And some of these were very fine. They occur in this so-called royal blue color, whereas the Sri Lankan stones tend to occur in what we call a cornflower blue color that you can see here, or even better, this peacock blue color, where in Sri Lanka they compare the best colors to the tail feathers or the neck feathers of the peacock. Then in the 1880s, there was a landslip in the Himalayan mountains in India, south of Zanskar. North of Zanskar, south of Ladakh. And they uncovered some extraordinary sapphires. These stones had the best qualities of stones from Burma and Sri Lanka. They also had a softness to them that allowed them to hold the color in many different light sources, what we call a velvet blue color. And the production from these mines was only for a very brief period, perhaps 10 years. And then after that, the qualities that they were finding were very low. And so these stones became the standard by which all other sapphires were compared. Now you flash forward to the year 2000 approximately, and they started to discover fine blue sapphires in Madagascar. And some of these stones had exactly the same appearance as the stones from Kashmir, with this velvety blue color. And many of the labs that were doing origin reports actually misidentified them because they had features internally that looked very much like Kashmir. And so suddenly the market of Kashmir, quote unquote, Kashmir sapphires increased by 10 times in terms of supply. Now, what about prices? Well, for some stupid reason, a fine blue sapphire from Sri Lanka, it might fetch $7,000 to $8,000 a carat, even $10,000 a carat at the top level. But if you have the same quality of stone and it comes from Burma, the price can be $30,000 or $40,000 a carat, even though there's no visible difference in the quality of the stones. And then if that same stone is from Kashmir, it can be 100,000 or more per carat for exactly the same quality. Well, what if that stone is from Madagascar? Well, it tends to be less than $10,000 a carat. And so there's an extraordinary artificial difference in price in stones of different origins. And by the same token, when it comes to ruby, again, I guess it was about 2008, 2009, they discovered an amazing mine for rubies in Mozambique. And some of these stones look just like the best Burmese stones. And the differences in price can be 10 times or 15 times based on the same quality. So if it were me right now, I would be buying Madagascar sapphire and Mozambique ruby, because eventually these stones are going to become very rare and valuable. In fact, we've already seen it. In the last few years, the quality of stone from Mozambique has dropped considerably. And the same is true for Madagascar. Usually the best time to buy stones is when a source is just discovered. There are a number of reasons for that, but the natural sorting and weathering over millions of years has winnowed out the bad parts of the stone, leaving just the pure behind, the essence behind. And so those alluvial stones get mined first. And it's only when all the alluvials are exhausted that they go into hard rock mining. And so in places like Burma today, it's almost all hard rock mining. I think you've been to Mogok and you've seen what's happening. 15, 20 years ago, there was a lot more alluvial mining happening. Now it's almost all hard rock mining. And so the quality of stone that you get from alluvial deposits is much greater than that which you would get from a hard rock mine. And so that, again, argues for buying when something is new. If a source comes online right in the beginning, that's the time to buy. You get better qualities and you get more selection, and nothing lasts forever. I remember in the about 1997, 98, 99, huge deposits of rubellite tourmaline and spessartine garnet were discovered in Nigeria. And I was working with Bill Larson at the time, Pala International. We had huge quantities of that stone, and we sold huge amounts of it. Today, all that's gone. The market has lapped it all up, and you just can't find those stones. And when you do find them, they're selling for much higher prices. So the time to buy stones is when the new discoveries are made. So that's a little bit on location. Another question is clarity important in rubies as it is in diamonds? Is it realistic to apply diamond grading standards to rubies or other colored stones? No, it's not realistic. The example I always give is that of the cashmere sapphire. A cashmere sapphire is more valuable because it does not have a glassy transparency. It has these soft inclusions that actually create a better quality because they cover up the dark areas of the stone. They cover up the extinction. So here in this, if you look at this velvet blue stone and you compare it to the peacock blue has very black areas. There's a lot of contrast between the black and the blue areas, where the velvet blue stone has less contrast. And the same is true for ruby. If you see this pigeon's blood ruby here, you can see that the color has a softness to it compared to this royal red stone, which has a lot of black extinction. And that's because of the silk in the stone. And so a little bit of silk is a very good thing in a ruby or a sapphire. You don't want too much. You don't want eye visible inclusions, but you want to have a little bit that softens the color and it helps to cover up the black areas that would normally be found in a faceted stone. And that brings us to another question. Let's see if I can find this section. People ask, well, how do you judge clarity when you're buying gemstones? How should you judge clarity? To me, it's all about the distraction factor. Okay, here is a smile scale. Okay, and you can see that if your stone looks like this, the first thing you do when the person smiles, you're going to say that person has a missing tooth. It's really, really distracting. And a lot of times it's very hard to look away from that. It's so distracting. So that's a stone that you really don't want to be buying. Now, what about here? You have a chipped tooth. That's far less distracting. What about a gap between the two front teeth? That's less distracting still. What about a missing tooth on the side? Well, it's hard to see, so that's less distracting. What if a person's teeth are discolored slightly? That's less distracting. And so when you're thinking about the clarity of a gemstone, or like with you, if you were buying a mineral specimen, if there's a ding on it or something, you have to ask yourself, how bad is it? Can I put the best face forward? Or every time I look at it, I'm going to see that immediately. And so that's, I think, how you have to think about the clarity in gemstones. Forget about diamonds. Diamonds are far more common than colored gemstones. And so you'll never get diamond-like clarity in colored gemstones. In diamonds, they grade clarity under 10 power magnification. But in colored gemstones, we generally use the eye. We will use magnification to make sure that we're not missing something. But the final judgment is almost always made with the naked eye. And so now here's part of the problem. Here you have two stones. Each of them has obvious clarity problems. This stone has a fissure going across the front, and this stone has so much silk in it that the transparency is visibly harmed. And if you don't have decent transparency, then the light cannot go down to the back facets and across and come back. And so the color cannot be as saturated if the transparency is low. And so which stone do you prefer? There is no right or wrong answer. Each stone is different. Some people might opt for this because there's no fissures. Other people might go for this stone because it has more transparency and maybe a little bit better color. And so these are all the challenges that buyers face when they're selecting colored gemstones. It's like choosing a wife or a husband or a girlfriend or boyfriend. It's a matter of taste, and taste varies. Okay, and then what about imitation stones and clues, how to separate imitation stones? Really, for ruby and sapphire, for the last 100 years, there have been cheap synthetic stones in the market. Synthetic ruby and sapphire have all the same properties as a natural ruby or sapphire. It's just that they're made by humans.
I'm
So they
sorry.
have the same hardness. Everything is the same, except who made it.
We cannot
Natural
see the
stones are made in
slide.
nature. Synthetic stones are made in factories. Some people talk about lab-grown stones. Vast majority of them are not grown in labs, diamonds or colored stones. They're grown in large factories. And some of the prices are so low that they sell for pennies per carat. And so what can you do? Well, if you are not a gemologist and you don't know what you're doing in terms of gemology, what can you do is you can go get a lab report from a good lab. That's the best advice I can give. You need to get a lab report from a good laboratory because some of the synthetics are not easy to identify. Here's some examples of different kinds of synthetic rubies. And so you can see they come in all different colors. And I think I have a picture here somewhere to show you the size. Some of them are very large in size. You know, every time that you go down to your local supermarket, okay, here's an example. These are sapphire crystals, okay? You can see sometimes they're enormous. Here's a synthetic ruby crystal. Every time you go down to your local supermarket, there's a barcode scanner and the person at the checkout counter swipes the barcode across the scanner. Well, that window on the scanner is made out of sapphire, synthetic sapphire. In the same way that the cover glass on many wristwatches is made out of synthetic sapphire. And it's just like natural sapphire. It has a hardness of 9. I have a watch that's 20 years old that has a sapphire cover glass on it, and it doesn't have a scratch on it, even though I've worn it every day for 20 years. Because sapphire, the only thing that will scratch it is a diamond. And I don't put my watch in contact with diamonds. And so, so synthetic stones have been made for over 100 years. We commonly have people who, they say, my grandmother gave me this stone and I know it's real. And I said, well, how old was your grandmother? And when was your grandmother born? And they say, well, she was born in 1920. And I said, well, it could be synthetic because the first commercial synthetics started appearing in the 1890s. They were grown by a man named Auguste Verneuil in France. And I have a picture of him here. And so those stones, you can literally have an antique synthetic ruby. You can have a synthetic ruby that's 100 years old. And here's the man himself, Auguste Verneuil. And this is the process that he developed. So for people who are not gemologists, there's literally no way you can know if something is synthetic or not, other than be suspicious when something is too clean. If something is too big or too perfect, you should be very suspicious. The other advice I can give you is don't buy stones on the street, okay? Don't buy stones from touts on the street. If you're traveling to a place like Burma, Thailand, India, or other places like that, never, ever allow anyone to take you to a shop because they will be getting a commission. And sometimes these touts are extremely sophisticated and they may tell you stories like, I'm a teacher and it's my day off from school. And they may meet you outside of a hotel or a tourist site and casually strike up a conversation. This is a trick as old as con men. And after they gain your confidence, sometimes after hours, then they'll tell you about something like, oh, today you probably don't know, but it's a special day and the government has no tax on jewelry. And they'll offer to take you to a store. Or I know a very good store, and my friend runs the store. You can get a really good deal. Or they may tell you that they have something that's been stolen. That's another old trick. I have some stolen goods and I need to get rid of them cheap. I can remember when I was living in Bangkok many years ago, and I got into a taxi. I would take a taxi to work every day. And as I was sitting in traffic, because the traffic in Bangkok is really bad, I remember the taxi driver, after I was in the taxi for a while, he turned around and he handed me a stone paper. And he said, one of my customers dropped this and I don't know what it is. Now, he didn't know I was a gemologist, but I pulled the loop out of my pocket and I took a look at it and I saw it was synthetic and I handed it back to him. I said, it's a fake stone, don't worry about it. Okay. And I think it was only 1 or 2 days later that I happened to be in a different taxi, stuck in traffic on my way to work. And the taxi driver turned around and handed me a stone paper. And he said, one of my previous passengers dropped this and I don't know what it is. And I looked at it and it was a synthetic stone. And I came into work and I told the lady that is now my wife, I said, you wouldn't believe 2 days in a row, the people have dropped synthetic stones in the taxi cab. And she said, you're so naive. You know, you are so naive. And so these are the things you need to be aware of. Buying at the source is always the most dangerous place to buy. In fact, I have a little section of my book called Dick's Law, which is that the closer you get to the source, the more synthetics you will find. The very best synthetic stones will be unearthed in front of you at the source. That's when you really need to watch out. And there's a reason for this. It's because the people at the source know what the natural stone looks like. And so they're better able to create something that looks natural. One of the things that you never ever see in sapphire, synthetic sapphire, is a stone that's both blue and yellow together. But it's very common in basaltic sources. And so what do? Well, they will take a piece of blue synthetic sapphire and they'll put a little yellow stain on the outside. And the average person, when you're buying it, you take it and you look at it, you hold it up to the sun and you see that yellow in there with the blue and you know it's natural, except it's not. So the very best fakes are always the things that you find right at the source. And the people who are at the source know very, very well how to cheat you because they've been doing it for centuries. And so you really need to know what you're doing if you're buying something at the source. And usually when you're buying at the source, it means you're buying rough stones. And that's even more difficult to buy than for faceted stones. So you got to be careful. I've had dealers come to me and they say, you know, what can I do? These are big dealers who 30, 40 years in business. I said, they bring me a stone. I tell them it's been heat treated, a ruby. And they say, well, what can I do? I bought this in Mozambique. And I said, there's nothing you can do because even the poorest miner, don't underestimate them. They know exactly what you're looking for. And they now know, because of the internet and other things, they know that if they take their rubies and heat them over a fire, they can drive off the bluish tint, make them more red. And so even if you buy something in a little miner's camp out in the bush in Mozambique, it doesn't mean that it hasn't been treated. And furthermore, in the markets in those places is also problematic. And just to let you know what this looks like, I'm going to show you. Okay, here's a window where people buy rough stones in Madagascar. This is in the Ilakaka area. And this is in Ilakaka. This is at a friend of mine's place where he buys rough sapphire in Madagascar. And I spent a day in his shop watching people bring in things, and I bought a sampling of things. I knew that a lot of it was a problem, but I wanted to buy it because I wanted the samples. And so we divided these into these 5 different piles. And these stones, the red and dark blue stones here, these are all Verneuil synthetic corundum that have been broken up to make them look real. This big blue stone is glass. This is actually genuine sapphire here. And then these are genuine sapphires. I'm sorry, these are actually spinels, not sapphire. These are genuine sapphires. And these are stones where the color was put on the surface. So they'll take a pale colored stone, rough stone, and they'll rub it in carbon paper. And all of a sudden you have a much deeper blue color. And so that's the kind of thing that goes on. I think I have a photomicrograph of that I can show you. That's the kind of thing that happens at the source. So you got to be really, really, really careful about buying things at the source. Here's, I think, the example of that. So this is a stone where they rubbed it in carbon paper. The actual stone was near colorless and now it's blue. Here's another stone that had a coating applied to it. And here's a stone with a fissure and they put blue dye into the fissure. There's all kinds of things like this that can be done. Here's a necklace of ruby beads, except they're not ruby, they're actually dyed corundum, dyed white sapphire. And so all these kinds of things are possible if you don't know what you're doing. So if you're trying to get into the business and you want to know, well, what should you do? Buy from somebody you can trust. Never ever buy anything from someone where if there's a problem, you can't go back to them. And so people say, well, how can I buy at the source? Well, you take your chances. You can only buy at the source when you're willing to lose, because there's no recourse. You're not going to hunt down the miner that sold you that stone in the market or on the street. And so the people who do buy at the source, they buy on a percentage basis. They'll buy large lots, and they're hoping to make their profit on the whole lot, even if they make a mistake on the individual stones in the lot. And that's how it works. So that's a bit about buying stones. And then the other question that was asked is, what about treated stones? And nowadays, we see very few synthetics in our lab because the laboratories have more sophisticated instruments today, and we don't have a big problem identifying synthetic stones. What we do see are increasingly sophisticated treated stones. And we also see kind of a back to the past approach to treatments, where we are getting better and better at identifying high temperature treatments. And as a result, because there's a big difference in the price of gemstones in the market, if something is treated, than if something is natural. This has happened in the last 20 years, and there's a couple reasons for it. Reason is the development of beryllium diffusion treatment for sapphire. And I'll show you some examples of that. the starting in about the year 2000 or 2001, Thai treaters discovered that if they heated sapphire in the presence of beryllium, they could produce a paparaja looking stone from a pink sapphire. So here's an example. This is the stone before treatment and then after beryllium diffusion. And so beryllium is a very light element, and it's not detectable with ordinary X-ray diffraction chemical analysis, which the labs had at the time. And so they couldn't identify this stuff. The result was that people stopped buying stones of this color, and many of the major laboratories had to start purchasing extremely expensive equipment to detect beryllium. And that equipment starts at about $60,000 and runs up to $500,000 or more. It's not a trivial expense for a gem lab. And so most of the major laboratories today have either LIBS, or if they're a really wealthy lab, they have ICP-MS testing for beryllium. And that testing is expensive. It doesn't pay for itself. It's basically, it's basically a money hole. The equipment might last 5 years, 6 years, and then it goes bad, or the company that made it went bankrupt, or whatever it is. So it's a huge investment, doesn't pay for itself. And so that was one of the things that happened. And so as a gem dealer, what did dealers do? Well, they could no longer count on using their loupe to identify stones. So they had to send every stone to the lab for analysis. That was a big change. The other factor was the appearance of Chinese buyers in the market. Over the last 20 years, large numbers of Chinese buyers have entered the colored stone market. And because of the communist period in China, where Mao took over in the late 40s until the 1970s, that was a period where Chinese did not buy colored gemstones, by and large. And so when they came back into the market in the 1990s, they came with the ideas from the 1940s and 50s. And the idea was that when you say a stone is natural, it means it's natural. It hasn't been screwed with. And they started buying stones that dealers from producing countries like Thailand, Sri Lanka, and so forth, they would say, this is a natural sapphire. And then they would take it back to China and sell it. At some point, the stone would go to the lab, and they found out it wasn't natural. It was treated. And so the Chinese buyers started demanding reports on every single thing they bought. And so that was the end of shoestring gemology. Because you couldn't identify this stuff with simple tests like a microscope or a loupe or a hand spectroscope. You had to have much more sophisticated instruments. And so that's kind of where we are today. Some of these treatments are very difficult to identify. The difference in price between a treated stone, let's just say this paparaja type sapphire, what's the difference in price? And if you want to see what happens to the stones, okay, here's before the treatment. You have these pink sapphires from Madagascar, and this is after the treatment. You have these stones that look like paparaja. Well, what's the difference in price? Well, this material, if it's pink sapphire, it might be worth $100 a carat. And if it's paparaja sapphire, it might be worth $2,000 a carat or more. And so there was a huge amount of money to be made. And the people in Chonaburi that were involved in this, they sank huge quantities of money into buying the rough and treating it. Unfortunately, the treatment was identified in 2001, and they were left holding the bag. with the result that a lot of the original material here is now worth more than the treated material here. The price just dropped precipitously because buyers said, no, I don't want this. It's like I don't want it. And in fact, major companies told the Thai gem trade that if they continued to do this kind of thing, they would stop buying stones in Thailand altogether. A lot of people started going to Sri Lanka to buy stones because of this problem. And particularly buyers, but not Chinese buyers, they think that's been screwed with. I want a real natural stone. And so the demand for natural pieces soared, and the difference in price between natural stone became extreme. And so now what we have is vast movement. We're trying to go back to.
Okay, good, right.
Okay, I think I lost you there for a second. Can I?
Yeah, the internet here is still not very stable. And I think we went through.
Okay,
yeah.
Just finish up.
Yeah.
I just wanted to, the last thing I was talking about is that now instead of very high temperature treatments that create radical changes, some traders are trying.
We've still not got.
Okay, can you turn your speaker on?
Okay, I can hear you now.
Okay, I can hear you now. So I just wanted to say that we've gone from the oldest heat treatment of ruby was a blowpipe heating that is over 1,000 years old, was described by people like El Biruni over 1,000 years ago, and was done in Sri Lanka. And now we're moving back to blowpipe heating because it's more difficult to detect. And that's because of the big differences in price between treated stones and natural stones. 20 years ago, almost everything was treated because the difference in price was not that great. But now, because of the Chinese and the beryllium diffusion, now even a low temperature heated ruby is significantly less expensive than a natural ruby of the same quality. And so now we've kind of gone full circle on that. And so for people who are collecting stones or buying stones, again, the importance of getting a good lab report is vital. And as I said before, many stones today come with 2 or even 3 lab
Hey, Joe, I'm
reports.
listening to a
Because
presentation on rubies.
it
Can I
is
give you a
more
call back in a little
difficult for
bit?
gemologists to
Alrighty,
do
thanks.
things
I'm back.
like determining origin.
Thank you, Jerry.
And so traders try to get a consensus of opinion rather than just one opinion. And I think that kind of wraps it up.
Thank you. I mean, thank you very much, Richard. And sorry for the technical glitches that have got in the way for this. I mean, one thing I wanted to add on the origin thing is, of course, when you look historically in geological time, all of these major gem belts were very, very much closer than they are today. So,
absolutely.
So you are really looking in many cases at, you know, very similar deposits. And so the idea that Madagascar somehow is in any way inferior to some of these other deposits is ludicrous from a geological point of view.
Yes, and one of the more promising areas of gemology is age dating of stones. And currently the techniques are not very good. They usually rely on finding zircon crystals cut through on the surface. But if you take, for example, the Mozambique belt and the sources that come from East Africa, Southern India, Sri Lanka, Madagascar, they all formed about the same time, between 600 and 700 million years ago, and in the same area. It's no wonder that gemologists can't separate Ceylon sapphires from Madagascar sapphires, because they're kissing cousins, so to speak. But if you take the Himalayan orogeny and all those deposits across the Himalayas, from Pakistan, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Kashmir, right on through to Nepal and Burma and northern Vietnam, those all formed relatively recently, maybe 50 to 10 million years ago. And so if we can age date stones, we could easily separate a Madagascar sapphire from a Kashmir sapphire, or a Burmese sapphire from a Ceylon sapphire. Unfortunately, we can't do that yet, but the theory is there. And if we can do that someday, I think we're going to find that there's an awful lot of quote unquote Kashmir sapphires that first saw the light of day from the gem gravels in East Africa or Madagascar or Sri Lanka.
Yeah. Thank you very
Okay.
much, Richard. It's been
All right.
absolutely fantastic, and I'm so
Thank you.
glad we were finally able to work something out so
Yes.
that we could involve you in this.